As journalists, it's our job to be tough on the president, regardless of his party affiliation, to be tough on all politicians. That's how it is. But it's incumbent on us to also be fair. And in fairness, right now, Joe Biden cannot catch a break. While overseas, the other most powerful Joe in Washington, Democrat Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, killed the latest Democratic attempts at climate change legislation. Again, Democrat Joe Manchin. Manchin used his crucial 50th vote on the Democratic side of the Senate aisle to dash all the president's most progressive policies, among them the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better, the $1.75 trillion Build Back Better, relaxing the filibuster for voting rights, relaxing the filibuster for codifying Roe, as well as the climate initiatives. List goes on. Thus, President Biden touches down tomorrow from Saudi Arabia to record high inflation, a completely derailed legislative agenda, and looming national strikes. The last one you haven't been following, we have. If you think the empty shelves crisis was bad before, wait until the longshoremen, that's the people who unload all the cargo ships, and the railroad workers go on strike. Yeah, it could happen. Some of these, of course, aren't the president's fault, but as evidenced by his approval numbers, the American people hold him responsible for it. Niall Stanage, the White House columnist for our partners at The Hill, joins us now. There's that old line with friends like these, who needs enemies? With Democrats like Joe Manchin, who needs Republicans?
Right, absolutely. I mean, you listed there a number of the Democratic priorities that have been derailed by Senator Manchin. And those aren't just a problem because of their substantive policy element. They're a problem because the derailment of them plays into the idea of an ineffective presidency, an ineffective party in power. And I think we see that particularly in President Biden's approval numbers with, for example, young voters and Liberal voters, particularly young voters with whom his numbers are pretty catastrophic, quite frankly.
Exactly. And it brings us to this idea that the president, he needs some kind of win. Certainly didn't get one overseas. While he was overseas and Manchin killed his climate change, today on climate commitment, the president said this.
I am not going away. I've used every power I have as president to continue to fulfill my pledge to move toward dealing with global warming. Thank you,
Mr. President, is Joe Manchin negotiating in good faith?
I didn't negotiate with Joe Manchin. I have no idea.
Huh. All right, so there is that. But this idea continually that the answer to President Biden's problems are from the left, not from the center. Is that because the White House is that scared of the progressive base?
I'm not sure that that's entirely fair, Leland. I'm not sure that really the problem for President Biden is being too far left or too far centrist. I mean, it's certainly true that he has a history of being a centrist figure and was perceived to have moved toward the left in winning the nomination and in the early part of his presidency. But the problem for him is basically inflation. And we see that across, certainly the Western world, whether governments are conservative or liberal leaning, and high gas prices, which are primarily a consequence of the war in Ukraine and the recovery from the pandemic, a disconnect between supply and demand. So I'm not wholly persuaded by this argument that he has shifted too far left. I think his problem is the basics of governance aren't really working for him right now.
Well, he's also not been able to make a deal with Republicans on anything, save infrastructure, which nobody particularly gives anybody credit for, because you rarely get credit for spending money. But is there anybody in the White House or any of sort of the larger Democratic apparatus that thinks the answer might actually come in a Republican Congress rather than in a Democratic one? I'm thinking Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, Obama and Boehner, who were able to actually get things done rather than when you have one-party rule?
That seems a stretch to me. I mean, of course, I'm aware of all the historic parallels that you mentioned there, but we're a very long way away from the days of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan now in terms of the atmosphere in the building behind me. Just to take one example of what you're talking about, Leland, and it incorporates Senator Manchin. On the voting rights issue, Senator Manchin initially rejected the Democratic proposal, the so-called For the People Act. And he said, no, I'm going to do a more modest proposal, the Freedom to Vote Act. I think that has more chance of winning Republican support. got zero Republican support and failed about a month after he introduced it. So is the empirical evidence really there that these moves toward the centre can work, can find comity? To me, the evidence is scant for that proposition.
You brought up gas prices, which is where we will end. National gas average today, $4.55. A month ago, all the way up at $5.02. So President Biden said today it's come down every day for the past month. It has by about a penny or so, still way above a year ago, way above where it was when he took office. Does the White House feel as though they can recover the feeling of economic uncertainty between now and November? Or you combine high grocery prices, the threats of strikes in the railroads and on the shipyards, on and on and on, that the White House feels as though they have to be in hunker down mode?
It seems to me they are aware of the scale of difficulties they face, particularly inflation. It's inflation that's killing them, really. They draw attention to the international parallels that I mentioned. They draw attention to the jobs and employment record during the Biden presidency, which is actually quite good. But it's inflation. You look at the polls, that's the biggest issue. You look at how people experience their day-to-day lives, that's the most damaging issue. It's now at 9.1% when we were told it was going to be transitory last year. That is the critical problem. And there's no real evidence that the administration can get its arms around it, particularly when the main levers to affect it reside in the hands of the Federal Reserve, not the President of the United States.
Yeah, and you've been along Washington long enough to know that the economic indicators in the economy do not necessarily follow a political timeline. In fact, they rarely do. Niall, it's always good talking to you. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to subscribe. Click the red button to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.